Rebel Author Podcast, where we talk about books, business, and occasionally bad words. Hello, Rebels, and welcome to episode 209 of the Rebel Author Podcast. Today, I'm talking to Lewis Jorstad all about how to write a series. But first, to last week's question, which was, where do you write? Heather Button said, where do I write? I write at my desk, or when travelling, wherever I find a desk-like place. But I always edit in a different location to give my brain a new reference point. So from my sofa, roof deck, cafe, etc. This week's question is, what part of story do you find the hardest to write and why? And the reason I'm asking this is because I have just discovered, and this is probably not going to be a surprise to any long-term listeners, the thing I struggle with most is history. So the backstory, the context, so I think I'm going to go on a learner binge and try and study up a bit about context and backstory and all of that good stuff, just so that I can bolster what I want in the next series. That was kind of a little discovery for me recently, and it makes total sense. Because context is at 33 out of 34 for me. So I just don't think about the past. I just always look forward. And for all of the historical fiction writers who know that I'm not a huge fan of historical fiction, you're probably all cackling to yourselves now, going, we knew that, we could have predicted that. Yes, I think if I thought about it, I probably could have predicted it too. Nevertheless, I am determined I will not be defeated by history. So, if you guys, actually, this is a good point. If you guys listening have a craft book recommendation that focuses on backstory, context, origin stories, anything like that, I would be super grateful for the recommendations. Please just DM me on Instagram at Sasha Black Author, but I am now hunting embracing context, embracing it, so that I can make the next series even better. The book recommendation of the week this week is Diary of a CEO by Stephen Bartlett. So I am reading this with my wife. We both listen to the Diary of a CEO podcast. It's fantastic. I love his way of interviewing. I love his attention to detail. And so I've read his other book, Happy Sexy Millionaire, and so I wanted to read Diary of a CEO. He is fascinating. He's only just turned 30. He's worth like £500 million or whatever. And he's just super interesting and super driven. So highly recommending that book. One of the reasons I'm recommending it is because he has a section on uncertainty. And I think uncertainty is one of those things in the industry that we all struggle with. We all struggle to keep going in the face of uncertainty. And that is one of the most important parts of our careers is, facing and embracing that uncertainty. And so, I really liked the section in his book on uncertainty. So that's my book recommendation of the week. Okay, so in personal news and updates then, I had a bit of a wobble over the weekend because I had some feedback from my editor that suggested I should go into a slightly different angle than I was comfortable with. So I kind of, reasoned it out, talked it out, got the edits done, and the edits are now with the editor for the copy edits, proofing bit. And I'm super excited. So I will be releasing the book. In fact, I'm not going to say the date because I'm going to say it next week, because today, after I finish the podcast, I'm going to be confirming the launch dates and all of the rest of it. So what else have I been up to? I'm giving myself now about a week to get all of the launch stuff ready. I am in the process of drafting my keynote for Vegas. I tell you, I think this might have been the hardest thing I've ever done. The levels of imposter syndrome that I am facing are excruciating. I am really struggling with... I am struggling to feel like I have enough value to give. And it's just really hard psychologically to, obviously, like, I love the stage. I love performing on the stage. I love speaking. I know I'm not afraid of speaking. What I'm afraid of is not delivering enough value in the content. And feeling like, you know, a lot of keynotes, I can't, if it was craft, I would just go on stage and teach, right? There'd be no issues there because I do that all the time. Keynotes are not classes. They are stories, they are journeys, and it's really tricky for me to feel like I can provide enough value when, as a number one competition, I have a certain goal and I haven't reached that goal yet. And therefore, like, this is so hard to talk about. Therefore, I'm literally like twisting my hands up. I wish you could see me because I'm really struggling to even like admit and talk about this stuff. But I guess there's shame involved in the fact that I haven't hit that goal yet. And so it makes it very difficult for me to value everything that I've done so far because I haven't hit that big goal. And that's ridiculous because obviously there's a lot of value in the journey, the training, the path upwards. But yeah, look, I'm just trying to be honest. I get that it's not the right mindset. You know, like, I know this. I've had my strengths coach like tear me a new asshole over this multiple times. I know this is not a sane way of looking at this. But you can't help your own psychological bullshit, right? So I'm just sharing mine with you. So yeah, like, I am so excited to deliver hopefully what will be a very inspiring keynote. I'm really trying hard to make it super inspiring, but like, I'm also really struggling. Like, it's so hard. So yeah, this is kind of the two main things that I'm doing this week are getting all the launch things ready, drafting Vegas stuff. After that, I will be working on brainstorming and outlining the new series and the course. So I think I'm switching. I have sort of got a set of class slide decks ready to film, and I actually think I'm going to film those second, and I'm going to bring a different course in its place. But I just want to finish outlining the course before I talk about that. But I'm so fucking excited because it's the thing I'm most passionate about right now. And we all know that when I'm super passionate about something, like, I will make sure it's the best thing that I can deliver for you. So yeah, I will talk about that more next time. Okay, so the Rebel of the Week this week is Sera M. Sera says, I have a younger sister who had a teacher who used to bully her and me. When she was in year 5, one day her and her classmate of hers had gone into the teacher's lounge looking for a teacher, but instead found a chocolate box and the lounge empty. They'd eaten the chocolate box between themselves and hid the empty box. When the teacher had asked them about it, they said they didn't know. I still cackle like a witch every time I hear it. As did I, because I knew where the story was going. Oh my God, I love that. How naughty and cheeky. Like, those are the kind of rebellions I just bloody love because they're so, but also, like, think about how much joy that probably brought them. Yes, it was naughty. It was very cheeky. It probably shouldn't have done it, but who fucking cares? It was only a box of chocolates. Oh my goodness me. I loved that story so much. If you would like to be a Rebel of the Week, please do send in your story. It can be any kind of rebellion, something big, something small, or something in between. So just 2 notes on this. We have discovered some Rebel stories in our junk mailbox. So if you have sent in a story before and it hasn't been read on the show, or you're pretty sure it's not been read on the show, please do send it in again because our junk mailbox deletes itself every 30 days. So we don't know if there were stories in the junk mailbox. We read every story out, every single story. So if you sent one and it's not been read out, please do send it in. You can email your Rebel story to Becca over on this email address, rebelauthorpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you and welcome back to returning and new patrons, Janita Kay and Kim Barton. A huge thank you to all of my existing patrons. You guys really do help to keep the show running. If you would like to support the show and get early access to all of the episodes, as well as bonus content like our writing and Q&A live sessions called Poison and Prose, the Slack community group where you can get access to me and like 100 other authors all vying to reach their goals. We do movie nights. We've got one of those coming up on the 11th of October. The masterclasses, our next masterclass is on dark academia and how to write that. Then you can from as little as $2 a month by visiting patreon.com/Sasha Black. Okay, I loved this interview. I loved talking to Lewis, and I really hope that you enjoy it too. Hello and welcome to the Rebel Author podcast. Today I'm joined by Lewis Jorstad. Lewis is an author and developmental editor who helps indie authors and soon-to-be authors master their craft and find their readers over at The Novel Smithy. When he isn't busy coaching students or writing books of his own, you can find him playing old Game Boy games and baking far too many homemade bagels. Hello and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I love this. So tell me about Game Boys, because I am of the era of Game Boy. So although the feminist in me doesn't really understand why it wasn't called a Game Girl, but whatever.
Yeah, I can't really speak to the marketing team behind that, but yeah, I'm one of those annoying people who's like, modern games aren't as good anymore. I'm just gonna go play Pokemon all day.
Oh my God,
because I'm blinded by nostalgia.
I love it. So which Pokemon did you? I had Pokemon Red and Blue.
This says a lot about me as a person. My mission in college wasn't to graduate. It was to beat every Pokemon game ever released. So I've gotten all the way up to the most recent one. And the most recent one, hot take for anyone who's a Pokemon fan, was so bad I didn't play it.
No. Oh, no.
So, yeah.
That's an incredible achievement, though.
I did manage to also graduate college at the same time. I will say I did fine. But, my priorities were a little different back then.
Okay. And so, obvious ultimate question. What is your favorite bagel?
I like salted bagels, which sounds very strange. But when I make bagels, before I bake them, I brush them with melted butter and I put like really flaky smoked sea salt on top. And it is a borderline religious experience. It's awesome. Highly recommended.
What fillings do you have then?
I'm usually just a straight like cream cheese kind of person. Occasionally I'll do a lox bagel if I'm feeling really fancy. But normally I like to keep it pretty simple.
Okay,
partially because I bake them and then immediately eat them.
We're going to be very good friends because bagels are one of my favorite foods and also one of my favorite things to experience in New York as well. And I can literally just eat like a whole... I have been known to eat bagels at breakfast, lunch and dinner. I love a bagel. They don't necessarily love me, but I love them. And I also am like completely basic and just love cream cheese in them. But yes, okay. This podcast isn't actually, in fact, about bagels. So I probably should ask you some relevant questions. So would you like to tell everyone a little bit more about you and your journey? Like, how did you get to where you are today?
Well, speaking of college, that's kind of how I ended up where I am today, in the grand tradition of me trying to beat every Pokemon game. I also was doing basically anything but my schoolwork in college.
What were you studying? I
have dual degrees in Asian history and political science.
Wow.
Totally unrelated, I know. And so amid all of that, I was spending most of my free time when I wasn't playing video games, like your stereotypical, 21-year-old college guy. I was working with friends and critique partners and, my fellow creative writing students for all of our elective classes on kind of what became editing in the long term. I had originally really wanted to do English lit as a degree, but I sort of talked myself out of it from I need to have a career, I need to make a living. And And so I went with something, I guess, more stable. History and political science. I'm not really sure what I was thinking at the time.
Obvious career path after that. Very obvious.
Exactly. Very clear career path. I should have probably gone into business or medicine, but I didn't.
I mean, astrophysics is a great choice too.
Oh,
after
absolutely.
a degree, right?
Not to mention, I failed calculus 3 times. And so I graduated from college, and kind of like you joked, I was looking ahead to like, well, what, where will I work? And basically the only option was to get a PhD and become a professor also, or get into government. And I graduated at kind of dicey time for government in the US. And for my mental health, the thought of going into that was pretty terrifying. And I also was ready to be done with school. I was like, I'm not in a place to get a PhD right now, financially or mentally. And so I had the really interesting idea of just kind of throwing up my hands and saying, well, fuck it. I'll pursue this editing thing that I've been wanting to do for such a long time, but have never made space for. And I gave myself 6 months to get to a point where I felt like I could actually make it work as a job. And I wasn't fully paying the rent at the end of those 6 months. I was very lucky that I was living in a very cheap place off of ramen and beans at the time. At the end of the 6 months, I wasn't quite in the green, but I was enough that I kept with it. And that's kind of where the novel smithy came from. It's just sort of never stopped. And I keep thinking back like, man, I could be a low level political organizer at this point. I'm so glad I didn't go that path.
So unlike you, I did not learn the lesson. And despite thinking it was probably a terrible idea for my mental health, I did actually go into local government.
Did you really? Oh, that's
I'm
amazing.
not even joking.
Oh no, I'm so sorry.
I know. Thank you so much. I've kind of dealt with the trauma and grief now. But I did. And worse than that, I was a project manager in corporate. I mean, you don't get more corporate than project management, and a worse place to do it than local government. But yeah, it was. I'm done with that now.
Yeah, don't get me wrong. Like I have a deep, unabiding fascination and like sort of like love for politics, like from almost a cultural level, like the mechanics of it, the people, the personalities is so fascinating. I couldn't survive in it. I'm too much of an introvert. I'm too much of a hermit. Like I can't deal with people in that environment quite the same.
I think if I had been on the political side rather than the civil servant side, so as in I was staff rather than a politician, I think maybe it would have been okay. Like I might have been able to survive longer as a politician than I could as staff. But, it was because I also still now have a deep-seated fascination, like the philosophical side of it, the social ramifications of it, like and one of the reasons that I don't talk about politics on this show is because I'm very political and I have very strong opinions about everything, and I would piss off people. So that is why I have a note, and it's across all my socials as well. Like I do not campaign on any fucking topic ever about anything because I'm so strong opinioned. But anyway, this is not a political show, so I'm going to move on from that very rapidly.
Sorry, dragging you into that.
No, but we should have like a coffee and talk about it because I find it fascinating.
Oh, we could entertain each other for hours. I'm sure that would be fantastic.
As long as you send me a bagel in the post.
Deal.
Okay. So we are here to talk about series writing. So do you want to tell everyone, first of all, the basics? What are the types of series that you classify as a series? And maybe could you like give an example of a couple of examples so that we understand those like in practice as well?
Mm-hmm. So sort of the caveat to all of this is that over the last couple of years, as I've been really digging into how fictional series are written, like how they're structured, how they're built, there are surprisingly not a lot of widely accepted terms to describe different types of series. And so the terms I use are some that I get from other places that like are sort of the norm, but some of them are just the best term that I could come up with. So I always tell people like, it's possible that what I'm describing, you would use a different term for, and we're probably talking about the same thing. It's just the terminology of it is still a little up in the air, sort of for the larger community. But I generally categorize series as one of four types. There are sequential series, which are sort of the series where it's really one big story told in multiple smaller, like full-length installments. That's, your Lord of the Rings, your Hunger Games, sort of the classic idea of a trilogy. They usually tend to be sequential. And obviously, it's not just like you wrote a giant book and then chopped it up into pieces and called it a series. Like there's still an art form to it. But that's an easy way to kind of conceptualize it. And then similar to that, there are episodic series, which follow the same principle in that it's one giant story, it's one overarching plot told across multiple books. But unlike, say, The Lord of the Rings, which is, 3 very chunky books, episodic is told in really small installments. So this is where, Kindle Vella is sort of coming to force. Tapas is another space for that. A lot of authors do this on Patreon, where they're publishing episodes of their series that are novella length or shorter. And that is its own sort of type of series, and that it follows its own sort of pacing and rules. And it means you have a lot of space for side quests and subplots and to sort of diverge from the main plot, do slice of life stuff and character studies that you might not necessarily have space for in a traditional like sequential series. Because each installment is so much shorter, readers tend to be more willing to stick with you through sort of into the like cul-de-sacs of your story and back. Again, there's an art to that, but it's why I consider the two to be kind of meaningfully different. And a great example of episodic series would be the Dragon School series by Sera Wilson. I think there's 20 entries in that series now, and they're each, just very short, sort of novella length books. And then moving away from series that have that one sort of overarching story, you get into static series, which are Jack Reacher, Nancy Drew, Sherlock Holmes, very common in thrillers and mysteries, where each book is standalone. Like they're not connected by a larger plot. You can technically read them in any order, but they're all linked by the same protagonist. So, the Jack Reacher series, every book is Jack Reacher, solving a crime or, doing his vigilante thing in different places. And so they have that sort of common setup and that common protagonist throughout each book. And then sort of the far other end of the spectrum from sequential series, from like The Lord of the Rings, would be anthology series, which are very, very common in romance, where you don't have the same protagonist in each book. You don't have the same plot in each book. They're very, very standalone, but they're connected by a larger sort of overarching concept, a big idea where, for instance, like the Bridgerton series, I imagine a lot of people are familiar with right now because the Netflix show, each book is a different sibling of the family. It's the same world. It's the same sort of culture and politics. There are some things that carry over from book to book, but they're really, you could read each book, you could pick up the 7th book in that series and perfectly understand what's going on. Even if it is making references to past books, because it's very much a standalone story. It's just told in this, beneath this sort of larger setup of this common family and this common world.
So that's what I write now is, but I call them interconnected standalones. Mm-hmm. But it's that thing where like the characters cross over, or there's, like you say, there's a trope is connecting the series, or, I don't know, whatever. But they are my favorites because, do you know your strengths? Clifton's strengths?
The strength. Tammy Labrecque spends great time trying to convince me to remember my strengths off the top of my head, and I never do.
Are
And
you kidding me?
She has a folder on me. It's really funny. We'll be on a call, and she's like, "Wait one moment," and she'll go look, and she's like, "Oh yeah, that makes sense with your strengths." I'm like, even I don't know my own strengths that well, but I think I'm like number one strategic or something if I'm remembering correctly, which kind of tracks.
Okay. So like you're gonna have to send me an email because I need to know what the others are. I can't understand that you don't know them off by heart. Anyway, the reason I like anthology series that your interconnected standalones is because I have Activator, and Activator gets bored real quick. So the authors who are able to create like 20 book series blow my mind, because I'm like, how do you stick with the same people, the same characters for like that long? Blows my mind. Okay. So in a series, we have protagonists, and protagonists' arcs will work differently in each of those 4 different types of series. So can you maybe talk a little bit about how to master like a protagonist's character arc in those different series?
So anthology series and static series are kind of the easiest for this because they are, I like the way you describe it, as they're kind of interconnected standalones. For an anthology series where you have different protagonists in each book, you really are just following all the same rules that you would for a standalone novel. Like, you're not trying to stretch it across the whole series. You still want to follow sort of the frameworks and best practices around making each book as strong as possible, like writing really strong character arcs for each one, but you don't as much have to worry about how they link across the whole series. For static series, because you have the same protagonist across the series, those protagonists don't usually have big sort of expansive character arcs. They might change in small ways across the series, but they tend to be pretty consistent, hence the term static, like they are very static characters. Oftentimes that means that they have a flat arc where their character arc is more about how they're influencing other people to change versus how they themselves are changing. But in some instances, they don't strictly have an arc in the same way that you might expect for a lot of novels. It's kind of a weird gray area. And then sequential and episodic mostly follow the same rules, and they're sort of the most complicated in that for those 2 style of series, because it's that big overarching plot, you need a character arc in each book. Like, you need some sort of stepping stone for the character to go through, but you also are sort of charting a larger character arc across the entire series. So again, to like pick on the Hunger Games, she has an arc in that first book. She learns to trust other people, like to be willing to make herself vulnerable to other people because that's how you survive. But that's also building towards a much larger series-wide character arc that really doesn't resolve itself until the end of that final book, which is a lot harder to sort of plan out and build out, but you get a lot of rewards for doing that. Like, it's a very powerful emotional moment if you can pull it off, which is why I think a lot of readers really like that type of series, because you get like very intense high points right at the end.
I hate reading the last books in a series because I am yet to find a series that ends satisfactorily to me. Like, I don't know what it is. Like, I have always avoided reading series, always. And I think it's because I get so like disappointed. Like, and it's not that the series end badly. They all have a great climax. We all get that moment. But for whatever reason, I'm just never satisfied with the end of series. And I think that is another reason why I have gone to writing interconnected standalones, because I don't have to do that. Like, I can do it in a different way. It's also one of the reasons that I struggled with this. So I'm just finishing the last book in a series of 3 interconnected standalones. And one of my questions to my beta reader is like, have I rounded it off enough? Because each book is a different story, but actually you've got characters that span. And I always think it's really important to give enough. Anyway, that is not relevant. But I just think for ending series is like the hardest job of an author, because you spent so long building it. You have to really up the ante without killing the protagonist, Veronica Roth. But let's like, actually, that's probably where, oh my God, it's trauma. Oh my God. Like that is when I stopped reading the end of series. I literally
You were so burnt. You were so hurt. You were
so
just
burnt. Oh my God. Oh, okay. Now I know that. Maybe I can go back and read them. But live on the Rebel Order podcast, Sasha has an epiphany. Okay,
We're having some
on.
therapy tonight.
Yeah. Right? Okay. What are the biggest mistakes you see writers making when they're trying to approach writing a series?
So actually, to kind of draw out what you just mentioned, like you ended that series and felt incredibly burnt. There are sort of three things that stand out to me that I think authors do that sort of doom otherwise really interesting series with a lot of potential. The first one is not being clear on your big idea, like on that overarching concept. Because no matter what type of series you're writing, you have some big idea that is linking all of those books. So maybe it is a common family. Maybe it is the same protagonist in the same sort of setup in each book. Or maybe it is that sort of big grand plot, but you need to know that as an author, because that's what you're promising readers. And that's kind of the second point is every book you write, when a reader picks it up, is making a promise to them of like, what is the experience they're about to get? What are the emotions they're about to feel? You know, you have to understand what you're giving to readers. And so that you don't get to the end of your series and kill off your protagonist and all of your readers are like, that's not what you promised me. Like that, you know, don't be wrong. There's something to be said for subverting expectations and sort of challenging your readers, you know, taking what they assume to be true and twisting it in interesting ways. But it's a balancing act. And like, you have to respect the promise that you've made to them.
Absolutely. So I had a really interesting conversation donkeys ago now with Gail Carragher. And she was telling me that the reason that Veronica Roth had fucked up so royally is because she used a heroine's journey as the series arc. And the heroine's journey is about bringing together, not she ended basically with a hero's journey ending rather than a heroine's journey ending, and that's why readers felt so betrayed by that series. So yeah, I think but yes, the promise is so important. There's so many things that you have to get right before, well, I don't want to say before. For me, it's before. But if you're, you know, somebody who writes into the dark, then not necessarily before. You can do it after. But anyway, I'm planning a new trilogy. So what do you think are the main things I should plan in advance? What kind of concepts, information, subplots, and character kind of things do I need in advance of starting this series?
So I would say that overarching concept I mentioned, like getting really clear on that from the outset. And you mentioned, you know, people who write into the dark maybe aren't plotters in the same way that I think we are. Even if you are a pantser, even if you are just sort of making it up as you go, you still need to know that overarching concept because that's your baseline. And so if you're sort of looking ahead to planning any length of series, not just trilogies, but any length, really drilling down into, you know, what is it that is connecting these books? Why is that connection there? And am I making that clear to my readers? Again, that promise, like as I'm starting book one, is it going to be clear to them what that overarching connection will be? And then once you sort of have that in place, then you can start to think about like, okay, well, how am I going to sort of stretch this story across the series? Because I'm a very firm believer that every story has a natural end point where even if you want to stretch it further, like it has run its course, it has reached its best conclusion. And there's something to be said for honoring that. You know, there's a lot of somewhat famous examples of series that got really popular and the creators just kept dragging it on and on and on. And by the end, everyone was like, this should have ended years ago. You sucked all the life out of it to try to stretch it as much as you could. And don't get me wrong, you know, I'm not going to tell people who are making millions of dollars off of their series how to do their job. You do you. However, I do think there's something to be said for considering that. And so for a trilogy, especially, trilogies are kind of fun because they have their own sort of rhythm and cadence. Like trilogies follow a very consistent flow. It's not even a structure in the way that like you might, use the hero's journey or like the 4-act structure to like structure a plot. It's very much just it's a flow between each book. And so if you're sitting down to write a trilogy, even for those who aren't plotters, but especially for plotters, sitting down and starting to get a feel for like, how will your trilogy flow across the 3 books? Book 1 is usually sort of set up. You're introducing this smaller conflict. It's still important. It still has stakes, but you are sort of hiding the deeper side of it. And then the characters resolve that conflict. And in doing so, they sort of blow open the doors and realize how much deeper this goes. They get sucked into a world that they maybe didn't expect. And then book 2 is where you can really just develop that and take what your readers thought was true in book 1 and just turn it on its head to show the deeper side of it. And then set that up for book 3, where you sort of pull all those threads together and really, really test your characters to kind of resolve what you set up. And so as you approach your series, taking some time to think about like, okay, how am I going to tell this story in that kind of flow across each book? I think is wise to do before you start, regardless of what type of writer you are, just because it sets you up to have an easier time and to make it easier for you to satisfy readers so that you are being cognizant of their expectations as they're reading and as you're writing.
I love this. Let's go even deeper into kind of the series arc. I know it looks different in different genres, but talk to me, I guess, about the main beats or plots that we need to hit in a trilogy, versus like how that would look across like a 10-book series, for example. And like we can use my series if you want as an example, because I do know I haven't started outlining each book, but I'm getting to that point. So it is a romance series and I want to do something slightly different. So one of the things that I learned from the Girl Game series is that interconnected standalones have serious potential for drop-off of read-through, because the Sequential series you can end on a cliffhanger in the way that I didn't in the Girl Game series. So although I had quite good reader retention, it wasn't as good as some of my friends who I've seen who've had like insane like levels of read-through because they have a cliffhanger. So my plan is to have standalone romances in each book, but to have, so the romance starts and finishes in book 1, and then there's a different couple in book 2, and then there's a different couple in book 3. But I want the fantasy plot line to go across all 3. So that there will be like a plot cliffhanger at the end of book 1, a plot cliffhanger at the end of book 2, and then obviously we'll draw it to a close at the end of book 3. So yeah, I don't know like whether or not we can maybe talk about that and what are the beats that you need to hit in those different points versus maybe what that would look like for somebody writing a much longer series.
So trilogies are sort of, again, kind of their own thing. And so for you, like looking ahead to a trilogy, I love the idea of like having that like underlying fantasy plot, even if it's kind of an anthology series, but it's almost a hybrid in that way. I think that's really clever and really interesting.
Thank you. I was like, I feel very smug about it. I won't lie.
Oh, absolutely. And to sort of draw on slightly tangent to your actual question, but to sort of draw on what you talked about like read through and having cliffhangers. As an editor, I have a very complex relationship with cliffhangers because I'm not saying this to you by any means, but just sort of to the general writing sphere. I think like 80% of writers use them wrong. Cliffhangers at the end of a book can't, at least in my opinion, can't leave the question of that book unanswered. So for instance, if the core conflict of book one is, who is going to, like, someone's trying to murder your protagonist. Let's say we're writing a mystery. Someone's trying to murder your protagonist. Book one is all about like figuring out who's after them. And you end book one with, a shadowy figure kicks him out a window and then cut. Readers are going to feel very burnt by that. They're going to be like, I just went through 80,000 words and you're not going to give me the ending. And now I got to wait 6 months for the next book. Like, they might pick up the next book, but I feel like you sort of betrayed them in that way. Versus,
which is exactly why the whole point. I mean, I write romance. That is, so the romance has to be complete in each book, because that's the promise. I write tropey romance. So like, if it's enemies to lovers, there has to be enemies, then there has to be lovers at the end of the book, right? But that's why I'm trying to, like you say, it's a hybrid. And I feel like a smug motherfucker. I feel like I'm going to get away with it.
Well, so what I like to do is to think of it more as like an open loop. Like, okay, so, for your story there, the romance plot line is really central. So you resolve the romance plot line, but at the end of it, you open a loop of, well, what's going to happen next in the fantasy plot? Like, you've resolved the central question of that first book, but in doing so, you've opened a bigger question that leads into the next book. And so I think that is in its own way kind of a cliffhanger. I use a different term just because I think people think of cliffhangers as the hard stop, like you trigger an explosion, but you don't let anyone hear the sound, like just a full stop in the middle. And I think that works in so few situations. It's a very delicate balance, but thinking of like, you're going to resolve the main point of this book and then open this bigger question of, yes, but this now has implications for X, Y, and Z, and is asking new questions. That pulls readers in while still making them feel like they got the experience that they were looking for. And now let's continue. So I don't know. That's sort of my like spicy anti-cliffhanger take, not necessarily to your question. But to your questions about series sort of plot arcs, trilogies are very much their own thing. And so in some way, I almost wouldn't compare them with other like lengths of series, just because they were the gold standard for such a long time in so many genres that they've sort of developed their own cadence and expectations. But for other series, really the way you sort of pace it out is, it depends on the type of series. So for a static series, because they're all, or anthology, because they're much more standalone, you have a lot more flexibility in how you do that. But for anything with that sort of overarching plot, so in your instance with kind of a hybrid, you still have that larger plot. And my goal always with that is to strike a balance. So I use the 4-act structure in most of my work as both a writer and an editor. And so if you're dealing with the 4-act structure, if you're writing a 10-book series, you kind of have to pull back and like look at those books on a larger scale and say, okay, well, in terms of my series-wide arc, where are my different crossroads falling? Like, where is my first crossroad? Like, where is sort of the midpoint of this larger series? And across 10 books, if you have all of those sort of squished together at the beginning, and then you have your finale of the series in the last book, that's going to feel very disjointed to readers. Like the pacing will feel very off, versus if you were able to sort of spread those a little more evenly, where like book 1 was sort of that first crossroad, and then you sort of had a midpoint around book 4 or 5, and then you had that sort of dark night of the soul in like book 7 or 8, and then you sort of wrapped it all in book 10. It's hard to give like these are the exact beats you need to hit in every book, because it will depend slightly on the story. But trying to strike that balance is sort of the general advice I would give most people, is to like think about the structure that you're using. You don't have to use the 4-act structure. That's just what I use. But then how can you pace that out across the whole series in a way that feels balanced and feels natural for readers?
Okay, let's talk about second books, because they have a bit of a notorious reputation for not being as good as book 1 and book 3. So, of course, I'm still talking about a trilogy here. But how can we keep book 2 Or if we're doing later books in a series, let's say you have got a 10-book series, books 4, 5, 6, maybe even 7. Like, how do you keep things fresh? How do you keep readers engaged in that series as engaged as they are in book 1?
I would say to always raise the stakes in every subsequent book. That doesn't necessarily have to be like grand raise, like you don't have to go absolutely, crazy with it, but raising the stakes in some way and shifting the dynamic of the story. So in book 1, readers get used to the story as it is a certain way. Like, these are the characters I'm dealing with. This is the conflict they're dealing with. This is sort of the system, the world within which they live. But then in book 2, if you can come in and say, oh, well, these other characters are arriving on the scene that are changing sort of the balance of power. These mechanics that you thought, if you have magic systems in your story, like the magic systems you thought worked a certain way actually have a deeper layer to them, or there's this aspect that maybe the characters don't understand or that is new. How can you introduce new locations? How can you introduce new relationships or bring back relationships from backstory that you sort of touched on in book 1, and now they've returned to sort of throw a wrench in things. Really, if you can figure out what readers took for granted in book 1, or if you're doing a longer series, like what have they taken for granted up until now? And how can you challenge those assumptions and quite literally like throw a wrench in things, both because it means your characters have more to struggle against, which makes that more dynamic and interesting. And because it keeps readers on their toes. Like, anything can happen in this story, and that's really engaging.
Have you watched How to Get Away with Murder?
I haven't.
Oh my God.
I know. I'm so sorry.
That series is like the perfect example of that, of how to turn things on its head, because there are like so many twists in that series that I actually can't fathom how the writers wrote it. Because there's so many betrayals and double blinds and bluffs and double bluffs and triple bluffs and like twisting characters, backstories that, and revealing things later that you had no bloody idea about. That it is, I honestly think it's an absolute masterpiece that Shonda Rhimes did. Like, don't get me wrong, it's super dramatic, but
that's kind of her thing,
but in the way that Riverdale got a bit ridiculous, but also like, I'm here for that. I kind of want that. Like, give me that. But that's a great example of what you're saying there. If you haven't watched it and you like Shonda Rhimes' work, because like I'm actually making a point of going through every single series Shonda's ever done, and I mean, Scandal is always going to have the top spot for me, but this is a very close second, I have to say. And I love Grey's Anatomy as well. So anyway, right. What do you do when you've written yourself into a corner? Perhaps you've already published a book and you can't undo what you've already done. Maybe you are halfway through a draft and you're stuck. And maybe it's because you don't know about something later on in a series or something that you've done before and now you don't know how to get out of it. What do you do when you've written yourself into a corner in a series?
I would start by taking stock of like where you're at. Especially if you already have books published. Because again, we've talked a lot about like, what are you promising your readers? Like, what are they expecting from you? And even if you're sitting there, like even if you're George R.R. Martin, you're like, I've written myself fully in a corner and this last book is never coming out.
Right.
You still have to, I cannot fathom how he wrote that series as a pantser, as a full self-proclaimed, no plan, both a masterclass and a cautionary tale. He is amazing and also terrifying. But
do you know who else is a pantser who's slightly terrifying? Pierce fucking Brown.
Oh.
Did you know that? He is a pantser. Like, how the hell did he do that as a pantser? I haven't even read the whole series, but I read Red Rising, and I was just like, oh, come on. Come on.
I'm such a plotter that like I can't fathom how people pants as well as they do. Like, it's a dark art to me.
It's wonderful. Like, I covet the skill. I covet it. I mean, I don't know. When you say you're a plotter, how much plotting do you do before you start? Like, what does it look like to you?
So I say I'm a plotter. I actually would consider myself more of a puzzler, but that's not as much of a used term. So I usually just say plotter because it's easier. My stories come to me in chunks. So I will like have a absolutely vivid, like, word by word concept of like 5 different scenes and no idea how they connect. And so my process is to then take those and start to like puzzle them together and like, okay, well, how can I fill this gap? How can I fill this gap? And for me, that's basically writing, I call it a bullet draft, but it's basically a 0 draft or like a really rough first draft, where I just write the whole story in bullet points, like as I puzzle out where pieces go. And then I go in and I sort of turn it into a proper first draft, so to speak. So I'm a pretty aggressive planner. Like I usually have a pretty solid idea of sort of what I'm doing and where the story is going.
Do you have like thousands of words in notes on like before you start?
I will write like 30 to 40,000 word outlines, easy.
For listeners, my jaw just hit the floor. Okay, so I don't think that I'm necessarily as much for a plotter as I thought I was, having just listened to that. So here's what I do. You see this here? Like, so for listeners, I have a whiteboard and it has Post-its on it. I had a look the other day, funnily enough, back through the last 4 books I've written. I averaged 26 Post-its and that's it. I have 26 Post-its and if it's not on there, I just start anyway. So like, I feel a bit uncomfortable that you just 40,000. I mean, that's a whole heap of words.
Yeah.
That's a whole book right there.
I think the secret is, and this is always kind of funny to admit, I hate writing first drafts. It's like pulling teeth. I'm miserable from word 1 till the end. My brain, I'm not just an editor as a job. Like I have an editor brain. I'm sure when you see my clips and strengths, you'll be like, oh, that tracks. But so for me, the planning is how I get myself through my first draft, because I get so caught up in like the perfectionism of it that if I didn't have a really beat by beat plan, I would lose myself. I would let go of the story because I'd get overwhelmed. So for me, I write by scene, not by like word count. So if I have a goal, I'm going to write 5 scenes this week versus I'm going to write 20,000 words.
Yeah.
And so what I do is I actually have each scene on an index card and I like tape them up this giant wall. I look like a crazy person, like the guy with string, like, and then this happened. And then the postman, I'm like that.
I mean, you can see a crazy diagram on this one where I was trying to explain how a bit of magical tech worked to somebody the other day.
Absolutely. Whiteboards are like the soul of writing for me, like having a good big old whiteboard. But so I have each scene on an index card and I will write that scene for my first draft. And then I will remove it from the wall. I will stick it in a box. I will take that scene, put it like save it as a file, put it on a USB drive and put the USB drive in a drawer. I call it black hole writing because if I leave it up, I will be so tempted to go back and obsess over it that I will never move forward. And so I take the story in chunks that way so that I can literally, like, as I write, just mentally delete everything I've written so that I can keep moving forward without my like editor brain turning on. And then once it's all done, then I turn my editor brain on and I just have a blast, like making it all polished.
Do you write in order?
I do. I don't plan in order. Again, it's that like puzzler aspect, but I write in order just again, because like that perfectionist brain.
I'm going to tell my friend about this because I have a friend who can't help but go back and edit. Mm-hmm. And then they end up cycling and not getting to the end of the book. So I'm going to tell this person about that. And I hope that it helps them. So I have a similar issue in I have to avoid editor brain at all costs. Not because I have an editor brain. I really don't. I fucking hate editing. I love is making prose pretty, and I love helping other people. So like I enjoyed editing others more than I enjoyed editing myself. but I have like the self-doubt cycle. And the way I've gotten around that is to write really fucking fast. If I have to basically outrun my editor. If I write fast enough, then the editor can't keep up because the editing bit is slow. So yeah, like that's basically what I've done. But I find it very interesting because there are definitely elements of similarity in the puzzling bit. That's how I definitely puzzle out the book. Like there's things that come to me about like the series that we've been talking about. I have like concepts and bits of the world and bits of who the characters are, but not necessarily that like, so I know the three protagonists, but I don't know the love interest. And then, so it's stuff like this. But yeah, I mean, I don't even know if I have 1,000 words of outline. I mean, it's whatever can fit on 26 post-its on average, which like kind of blows my mind. So maybe I am more of a pantser. I suppose what I do have is a very good concept of what the scenes need to be, like, but I don't necessarily know how they're gonna. Yeah, I must be somewhere in the middle then, I guess.
I mean, it's all a spectrum. Like, there's no like one way. Like, if you're a plotter, you have to have the 30,000 word outline, or if you're a pantser, you have to have nothing. There's no one way, but I will say my outline is really it's the draft. Like when I say it's like a bullet draft or a zero draft. Yeah, skeleton draft is a great term for it. It's what I'll do during that stage. So I have my sort of index card stage where I'm like puzzling through like where the different pieces will go. And then when I still have a bunch of holes, but I sort of exhausted everything I can think of, I'll sit down and I will write the novel in emails to myself. Again, anything so that I can just hit send and it disappears and I can start over. Because that's how I outrun my like perfectionism. And so I'll just in like bullet points, I'll just like type out on my tiny little phone keyboard because it prevents me from being precious about it. Like sentence by sentence, like, well, and then this will happen, and then this person will do this, and then, but this is a problem because of this, and then this is the backstory, and then this happens, and I just kind of go, and then I get stuck, and so I'm like, okay, and I hit send, and I start over, and I keep going forward until I've mostly mapped the whole thing out. That's where my outlines get long, is because I'm basically writing the story, but that gives me enough to work with when I sit down to write the actual first draft, that I can't obsess over it enough to talk myself out of writing it, which has happened for many a story.
Oh, I love this. I love the idea of, I'm going to torture my friend and tell them that they should write stories in emails to me rather than sending it to themselves, because then I will save it into this is a real kidney punch, this one. But when you have friends like this, it's great to be this friend. I am that friend. No, because then there's no temptation to go back, right? Like, because you haven't even got access to it. I feel so evil.
It really works. It works. I say that it works. I have a student recently I've been talking with. They've been struggling with a lot of writer's block, and it has kind of a root in overthinking. They get to the same part of the story every time, and then their brain starts to overthink themselves, and they just start to circle back and forth, and they lose steam. And I suggested, like, well, black hole writing is what I call it. Like, literally write when you're done with a writing session, put it on a USB drive and like give it to your wife, give it to a friend. Like, you can't access it, just toss it in a black hole. But for her, that almost makes it worse, because now she's like, well, what did I say in that scene? And like, am I totally messing it up? So it doesn't work for everybody. No, like, you have to really be able to compartmentalize, but it's always worth a shot. Like, if that's something someone's struggling with, you never know what'll click with your brain.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. Talk to me about series Bibles. So we've talked about series Bibles before on the show. So I was keen to kind of like ask you a question that sort of talked a little bit around them. So I guess my question is, like, one, give us a basic definition of it, but two, what like are the key things that we need to put into a series Bible? And like, what is the kind of stuff that writers are like reluctant to put in, but probably should, because they'll save themselves later down the line? Like, there's always that thing that you forget that you've said, and then you spend 5 hours trawling the manuscript for it. So yeah, like what do we need to put in that we're not putting in that trips us up?
So, sort of as just a basic definition of a series Bible for anyone who might be new to that as a term, it's similar to an outline, but it's sort of on a much higher level. Like, it's much more broad and general. A series Bible is kind of just a document where you save the like key details of your series so that as you're writing, you're not having to flip back through. Like you're on book 10 and you're like, well, wait, what did I establish in book 1 that I can't remember anymore? It kind of saves you a lot of that work. So character names, locations, basic world building mechanics, like what is your overarching concept? Do you know the plot, sort of main plot beat of each book? That kind of stuff. But the thing that I see people resist the most for series Bibles is actually a style guide.
Oh, God.
I know. And I say that as someone who also, I resist it for my own writing, but my proofreader actually, bless her, finally was like, you have to do this. Because, do you spell that character's name with a U or an O? Like, is that location capitalized or not? Like that kind of stuff, you would be surprised how much comes up again as you're in later books and you're like, do I hyphenate their double last name or do I not? And then you get on an hour-long tangent, like searching through past books. You find 5 places where you did it differently. Now you're going back to try to fix those, or the book's already published and you're freaking out. Like it's such a little thing just as you go to make notes of that stuff. But it makes your life easier, and it means your proofreader doesn't charge you as much money because she doesn't have to build a style guide for you. And that's great for everyone involved.
No, absolutely. I love that. And actually, I didn't do that in my first series, but I did do it in this most recent one. And you've reminded me that I need to start doing it for the next one, as I'm already starting to come up with like magical concepts and things. Okay. Well, this is the Rebel Author Podcast. So tell everyone about a time you unleashed your inner rebel.
For anyone listening, I'm sure you can tell I'm not a particularly rebellious person. I'm a very like structured kind of guy. But a couple years back, before the COVID times, my boyfriend and I bought a sailboat with the intention of living on it full time.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she was a absolute dumpster fire. She was in really bad condition when we got her. We had every intention of fixing her up. We were going to spend a year, spend all of our free weekends and time getting her fixed. We became electricians, we did plumbing, we climbed masts, we did hull repairs, we did everything. She needed a lot. And then COVID hit and we couldn't really leave because we'd be relying on shore services, which are closed because of COVID. So we waited a little bit longer and we fixed some more things. And then COVID finally got to a point where we felt safe to sort of go. Enough stuff was open that we had the services that we would need to sort of function. And we sold all of our stuff. We gave up our apartment. We were both still working. So we were working remote. I obviously was working for myself. His company was like, yeah, we don't mind you working remote. His boss actually also used to be a sailor. So he was very on board, which was very convenient. And we moved on board. And we got settled in. We stayed at our home marina for about 2 weeks, actually, while a storm rolled through, like the worst storm that the area had had in years. There was like a foot of water over our dock. So we were just fully like playing ping pong with the other boats. That was a stressful first night. That was literally our first night on board.
Oh my God.
That was a lot. A precursor of things to come. And then we finally left once the storm had passed and it cleared up. And the first thing that happened, we got to the middle of the Chesapeake Bay and our boat broke down. Our engine fully killed itself. We ended up stranded on a very remote island in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay for 4 or 5 days. And when I say remote, like they have 120 full-time residents. There is no government on the island. They are run by the Methodist Church because it's the only structure there. It is a truly fascinating place. They flood like couple times a year. And so everyone's just like used to shoveling water out of their houses. It is a wild place, truly like a fever dream. We met some amazing and very strange people, both in equal measure. But they was in the middle of a gnat season. Now, as you might imagine, this island is basically just a swamp with a couple solid pieces of ground that people built houses on. So when I say gnat season, I mean like black clouds of gnats at all times. And we're on this boat with no running water. Our fridge is broken down. Literally everything broke in that first trip. It was really bad. We're covered in engine oil and grease, 100% DEET bug spray, bug bites. We're sweaty. I have never felt so physically disgusting in my life. And yet it was also like an amazing experience. Like we genuinely met some really awesome, fascinating people. It was like a fever dream. But yeah, that was my moment of rebellion. Is we moved on to this boat. Everyone in our life told us it was a terrible idea and that we would regret it. We don't regret it.
But it was a terrible idea.
But it was a terrible idea. And yeah, so we finally got her fixed. Meanwhile, there's no cell service on this island. Like, it is fully remote. So I couldn't check in with any clients. My boyfriend couldn't get in touch with his boss to tell him what happened. We finally got it fixed and left. The next place we got to, it broke down again.
No.
It broke down like 5 times before we finally were just like, we can't afford to keep fixing it and getting stranded in strange places. So we came home and had given up our apartment and everything. So we proceeded to sort of like hop between friends' houses while we tried to get our life in order. It was an interesting 18 months of life. We finally are sort of settled in our own space again. But we don't regret it for a second. It was a wild time.
Well, welcome home. And I'm glad you finally got somewhere that's not going to flood, hopefully. Fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah. Tell everyone where they can find out more about you, your books, your services, anything else you'd like to add.
Well, sort of the impetus, the spark that sort of got us together for this podcast was that I have a book coming out, Beyond Book One, about how to plan, write, and publish fictional series. So if anyone really enjoyed this chat and kind of wants to dig deeper, I think that book could be a great starting place. It's been a labor of love for quite a few years. It's nice to have it out in the world. But in terms of where to just find me more generally, the best place is my website, thenovelsmithy.com. It's got links to, hopping on my newsletter if you want to stay in touch, checking out my books, my other books. Basically everything I have going on lives there. So that'd probably be the best place if people were interested.
Amazing. And I'll make sure all of those links are in the show notes as well. Well, thank you very much for your time. And of course, a gigantic thank you to all of the show's listeners and all of the show's patrons. If you would like to get early access to all of the episodes, you can do so by visiting patreon.com/Sasha Black. I'm Sasha Black. You were listening to Lewis Jorstad, and this was the Rebel Author Podcast. This week, I'm joined by Melissa Torres, and we are talking all about writing and selling middle grade fiction.
Don't forget to tune in and subscribe on your podcatcher. And when you have a moment, please leave a review.